Welcome back, ladies and gentlemen, to another adventure into United States history, addressing part 4 of How Do We Know? Okay, how do we know? We're presented with a lot of complexities, right? A lot of things are happening. So what we're going to talk about today, it's going to be a lot of fun. Must know, little known United States history that makes a massive difference to critical thought, okay? By the end of this presentation, if you understand the impact of what you do not know has on what you should know, then we will not have succeeded in our presentation today, okay? There are really cool nuggets, and I can't even cover them all today, but these are just some of the big ones that I've picked out over the years. Before we jump in, let's remember part 3, the major United States historical precedents. One of our major first discussions there in part 3, that we went from an agrarian to a more urban and suburban landscape over time. An agrarian society of independent self-reliance and agriculture to more of a complex society of integrated industry and agriculture. And that is a major transition, and now most Americans are in some way integrated into the infrastructure of a complex industrial society. And the pivot point that makes American citizenship unique in the world at the time is that roughly every citizen owned private property. That was a very unique feature, distinguishing United States historical development so much differently than Europe. The impact of technology over time, from the radio to and the phonograph before that, to the television and the computer and the handheld devices, and how it's changing how we live. Changes in the American dream and how that has changed over time, maybe from more of a economic manifestation via achievement of the dream to an American dream more based on consumerism, and the material. East versus West, the Cold War and the post-World War II era for the United States, but really the larger idea of the ideological battle of communism and capitalism and democracy, okay? Obviously, that has an enormous impact, right? And the system of American immigration is our second to last point there. That system needs to be comprehended, the major historical shifts in it and how that has impacted our immigration system even to this very day, and still does, okay? And the final piece here, globalism versus nationalism, really that struggle that is going on that we're seeing in politics, domestic, international, and the struggle between those two, tug of war participants. And what are we? We're on board for the ride right now, okay? So we're going to jump at the first one that I think is a real fun one to understand. The first little detail we're going to hit is the 1862 legislation that had come out during the throes of the Civil War. The economic changes were massive. What many, many people fail to understand is that the Civil War was deeper than slavery. Of course, slavery needs to take the #1 front seat and get the attention for our understanding of the Civil War, and I'll end up doing a presentation on slavery as the institution in a later episode. But for our intents and purposes right here, the Civil War wasn't all about slavery. The legislation that was able to be passed when secessionists, states' rights individuals had left the United States Congress and left it wide open to the Republican Party and its platform, which at the time included, more influence. Obviously, you have to win the Civil War. Nobody faults Lincoln for this. Nobody faults Republicans for this. Democrats, mostly Southern Democrats there, had withdrawn from the process. So they had seceded. And there's obviously, we're not going to solve the Civil War here. So what we want to understand here is the economic impact via the Pacific Railroad Act and the Homestead Act. What that will do is that will inject, basically change wealth. This will become how the business class really ends up being able, in the post-Civil War years, to finance itself, and this is the beginning of the real Gilded Age in American history. The men of Rockefeller, Vanderbilt, Carnegie, J.P. Morgan. And capital will be measured now in stock, which becomes much more heavily traded, and wealth becomes more liquid. Assets become more, flexible. People measured their wealth before by the amount of property that they owned, even in the United States. And now that's not going to be measured by that alone. It'll be measured by fluid wealth. And Promontory Point, where the rails meet, is that cool, significant point where the Union and Pacific, Central Pacific, and the Union Pacific Railroad companies meet. So that is a really huge component to your understanding of how we'll forge the industrial age. And giving land to the citizens in the North, it's really an interesting understanding. If that happens, if the government's offering free land, I think it might make more sense for you to remain loyal to the United States, don't you? Right. So that was a really interesting political move for sure by the Republican Party, and with the absence of states' writers there. And the Pacific Railroad Act, if I could say one more piece about that, the biggest capital asset that the railroad companies get is land, and land grants by the United States government. So the final piece of this is this solidifies the relationship in United States history between government and big business. Okay, government and big business now has a permanent relationship that has never gone away. Before the Civil War, it wasn't there. After the Civil War, it was 100% there and never going away. Okay, that's a major change in United States history. Okay. Now, the history of U.S. banking, this is a fun adventure. I'll try to get through this as smoothly as possible, but at the end of the day, it's a great narrative that needs to be understood. And we're not going to hit it all today. I'm going to do a simple explanation of the Federal Reserve here in a second, which is our current United States bank. But when we were colonies, the Bank of England provided and the joint stock companies provided the capital to invest in the New World. By the time the American Revolution rolled around and the Revolutionary War had ended, the United States was going to need a financial system, and the debates between Hamilton and Jefferson resulted in a national bank. The debates won by Alexander Hamilton, and we get a national bank. That national bank was to tie the nation's success to essentially the investors and the elite class, and that would stabilize, the system. If the wealthy people are going to be invested in the system, then they'll want to see the system succeed, and that's what Hamilton's idea was all about when he created that Bank of the United States and wanted to take on the debt. Because if you took on the debt as a U.S. government, that would, in theory, keep people loyal so that they could be paid back. It's the simplest explanation for Hamilton's economic plan. Now, again, I'm probably getting carried away, but let's move on to the history of that banking system. By the time of Andrew Jackson in 1836, that bank was perceived by many in the United States to be corrupt and driven by special interests. Go figure. Does this sound familiar? So Andrew Jackson, dealing as the common man's president, felt that way about the people, much like Donald Trump does today, so that's where we'll see that comparison later. But Andrew Jackson takes on the Bank of the United States, and he defeats it ultimately, and we won't have one of those again until the Civil War era, and that will only last for the Civil War. The nation will go to a final stage of national banking in the Federal Reserve System, and we've had that to the modern day. We'll explain a little more about that here on the next slide here, because the second and most important critical little piece of information, which is massively enormous that you understand, is the Federal Reserve and the Income Tax Amendment all occurred in 1913. These are the truths that should impact critical thinking about our understanding of the historical origin of this. This meant that the United States Congress, who had once had control over printing and coining money and minting money, and in control of the nation's money supply, had now given that responsibility over to the private banks as the Federal Reserve System. And it's a complex system. I'm not going to be able to explain every nuance of it today, but one of the interesting things about it appears in the Americans book. Ooh, and I have it right here. So in this book right here, this is how it explains itself to students. Wilson's solution was to establish a decentralized private banking system under federal control. Anyone catch that? Right? A decentralized private banking system, but under federal control. So private, federal, and central, meaning federal, and decentralized. It's meant to be confusing. It's intentionally confusing. It's unfortunate because most people don't understand the nation's monetary system, at least the basic premises of it, because I don't know everything. I will stop and tell you that I don't know everything about economics, but I know that. And what the Federal Reserve allows the government to do is gives it flexibility in spending and printing access to available resources. So what we're going to see as the ultimate result of this is really a pyramid of power that looks a little different than the one we looked at last time. So, and granted, this is an interpretation, okay? There are many interpretations that you can go through, but in the context of power, I'm not quite sure how this is able to be debated against, that this is a major feature that needs to be understood by most people. If you believe money is power, then you got to listen to this, right? Really, we know we are not in control. I'm going to start at the bottom there. We feel like we want to be in control, right? But people, the planet, all living things right there, as it says. But just above that is government, according to the pyramid that I subscribe to. I think this is a really interesting interpretation. We know that the corporations finance politicians. We know that they finance campaigns. So there is no way that corporations do not influence politicians through cash and through money. So that's over. That debate's long gone. And since the banks need to provide corporations with fluid liquid cash and access to a lot of money, right, so they can invest in massive projects, this isn't anything wrong. There's nothing wrong with this, right? This is just the nature of the beast. And above that would be the central banking system in any nation. And in the United States, ours is the Federal Reserve. And since it has total control over the nation's money supply, then it controls interest rates. It controls liquidity, okay, in the markets. And we know that the Federal Reserve has printed, probably over $20 trillion in the last, or printed, and I say printed, I also mean typed that into systems over the last, well, let's just say 10 years we'll cut them some slack, maybe the last 10 years. And we have established and racked up a massive national debt, not because the system itself is corrupt or anything like that, but think about this, it allows the government to print money whenever it needs it. And to borrow it, they're going to go ask the private bankers to borrow that money, whom they gave the ability to print the money already. So, and who pays the interest on that debt? That is the people. That is what taxation is. So understanding that major premise and why you might want to be concerned about the power of government, and this goes for Democrats, Republicans, it's everybody, the power of government, right? And the influence that they have is tied into the economic system clearly, and ours has been linked together since the Civil War, and it has only grown. In the post-World War II years, we added the IMF and the World Bank, and now these larger international banks, often funded by, at the time when they began, American investment capital. And these are going to influence world and global policies to a certain degree. And especially during the Cold War when, the world was pitted communist versus the West, or East versus West, the West believed in capitalism. So they were going to, and they ultimately won, so they won more influence. And they have owned this influence ever since. So, that's a lot, right? And the 14th Amendment, something that where we have had challenges to this system before. In the Gilded Age, people recognized this was a problem. You know, right when it started, they recognized it was a problem. And legally, the institutions found that that they could use the 14th Amendment recently passed during the Civil War that protected African American rights. They found out that the corporations did, that they could use that to, you know, declare that a corporation had all the same rights as an individual citizen did, because a corporation was an entity, okay? And that a corporation was a person, okay? And so if a corporation's the equivalent of a person and entitled to all the same rights, that really was going to allow a lot of freedom to continue to use money to influence things. And everybody knew this going to the modern era, and Citizens United was a Supreme Court case that upheld, the idea, it found that campaign finance reform, which had been passed in, I believe, 2007, was unconstitutional because money was considered a form of speech, okay? That's what the Supreme Court decided in that case. You can like it or you can't. I don't particularly really like that about those particular Supreme Court cases, but that's the way the law understood it. So, challenge now that we have is, we talked about last week, maybe debt slavery today. And a lot of people find themselves in tremendous debt struggles, right? Whether it's student loans, whether it's home loans, whether it's car loans, whether it's credit card debt. And when we're in debt, obviously this is the big connection to that. And in a sense, you understand how then power is going to be influenced over you, right? I mean, I have to pay my mortgage every month, and I have to figure out how to bring an income in, and it's very difficult, right, in this day and age. And how about that for empathizing what people are going through? You know, it's incredible. And everybody realizes the fragility, right, of our system in the way that it requires one another's cooperation. And when we're not cooperating, when we're not finding common ground, it's going to lead to greater division. So, and the way this financial system has really worked in the United States, it is a system of dependency. Now, it doesn't mean in and of itself that the system is corrupt. It's individuals within the system that probably should be making wiser decisions on behalf of all people, okay? So, we'll investigate some more of those issues on a different talk, but excuse me now. Let's go to big number 3, Theodore Roosevelt, The Bull Moose. This is just one awesome character and one awesome short story about third parties having an impact on an election and potentially being able to upset the apple cart. Now, Roosevelt had been two-term president, even though he came in following the assassination of William McKinley. But what Roosevelt had done is he technically could run for president again then. So he had decided to retire, essentially, and he went on a safari in Africa and handed his policies over to William Howard Taft, but basically he was upset at the change of progressive legislation because Theodore Roosevelt was a progressive, independent, strong, and self-righteous individual that believed in his policies and believed that he was the voice of the people and was a crafty politician, all the like. And a very effective president, very popular president for it. He was the first president that was going to take the reins of the federal government and use it to, bring in and bridle the corporations for the first time during the Gilded Age. And it sets off a new period that we talk about. Why? Because individuals do that. Individuals with the confidence and the political will and support they're going to initiate change. Theodore Roosevelt found himself in the office of the presidency on the assassination of a bullet. And we'll talk even more. Why don't we talk about his assassination attempt while he was running for the Bull Moose Party? That's what I got that picture up there, the old the bullet here in Roosevelt's chest when he was shot during a campaign running as the third-party candidate in 1912. He still gave the hour-long speech with a bullet in his chest and then went to the doctor. Theodore Roosevelt is an unbelievable individual and worthy of your guys' investigation and study. So And long story short with this election, I mean, Theodore Roosevelt we'll do another presentation on him, but Theodore Roosevelt, if William Howard Taft and the Republican Party had given Roosevelt the nomination as the Republican that he was before, he would have been president again. Instead, a split Republican Party that did not want to be progressive anymore and wanted more traditional Gilded Age, unfortunate traditional Gilded Age policies that Taft represented. And Roosevelt was more of the progressive, but so was the Democrat Woodrow Wilson. So with a split in the Republican Party, a Democrat, Woodrow Wilson, wins, and it impacts history significantly. We'll talk about that very soon. The bank, this is such a sensitive topic and one that it has to be handled as such. So there is a history of anti-Semitism in the Western world, right? In the world, there's a history of anti-Semitism, anti-Jewish feelings. And where does that come from? We have to know where it comes from if we're going to understand its poison. We're going to have to understand what the historical origin of this is. And simply put, this is a truth that it should impact your thinking. Most people are going to go to the foundation point of the Bible for this, so I'll use that the quote, right? You shall not lend upon interest to your brother, okay? Money in biblical times is obviously necessary. It's there and it's part of it. It's part of the history and all that. But what was going to happen over time is once the Catholic Church becomes well established, I can't remember the exact year this happens, but it was strongly suggested and basically demanded that Europeans and Christians, Catholic Christians, would not be in the business of lending money to make money because money itself is a vice, right? It can lead to sin and temptation, and that's the scriptural, spiritual way of looking at it. So in the New Testament anyway, which they represented, the Jews inherently were given essentially the right to become the majority of the money lenders in European society. It just ended up being that way because of a decision made, long ago by the Catholic Church. So this made, and guess what? When that happened, money still makes the world go round, and the Rothschild dynasty is one of the first and wealthiest dynasties that we have all heard of. It just so happens that they're Jewish, right? Because of the historic connection to that. Now, the challenge in that is when obviously Adolf Hitler deals with that situation with hate, right? And lashes out via the Holocaust, which is a thing that happened, right? We all accept that it happened, well, at least I do. I know there's some different kinds of thinking people out there, but I can't wrap my mind around that one. Too much evidence for me, as I accept that evidence. But anti-Semitism was not beholden to Adolf Hitler and Germany alone. In the United States, over up here, we had Father Charles Coughlin, who had a popular radio program in the 1920s and 30s about and attacking the financial institutions that we'll connect here in a second to other history. It just so happened that Jews and Jewish folks in the world were, as the majority of folks saw it, overrepresented in the fields of influence and power and finance. So that's where the anti-sentiment comes from, I think, from a financial perspective, right? I'm not going to debate scriptural intentions because that's everybody's search for the truth. You're entitled to your own search for the truth. So what echoed, or what I guess fanned that flame even more, was the results of World War I. And what I need to get into you with right now is the Nye Committee Report. This is a wonderful little piece of history that came out and helps you understand what's going on, because this is an agreed upon common report, a government report and understanding here. And this is a government report that we can have confidence in. Okay. Gerald Nye was a senator from North Dakota. And he was tasked in the 30s with investigating how the heck did the United States get in World War I. And make a long story short, his committee found that the main impetus for us getting involved in World War I seemed to point to the debt repayment as accrued by the British and the French to American banking and lending institutions who were supplying not just the resources, but also the capital to fight World War I. And it was looking in the middle of World War I like the Germans had a pretty good chance to win. And the United States really plunged itself into World War I when probably we could have, for all intents and purposes, stayed out of it. The evidence seemed to point in the direction that that a lot of money had been made out of World War I, and we didn't want to have that happen again. So Gerald and I led an investigation that came to that conclusion, and the United States Congress passed the Neutrality Acts in the 1930s, which stipulated that we are not going to involve ourselves in foreign conflicts, period. Now, the challenge with this is obviously World War II's on the horizon, and that crazy guy we took a look at a second ago, Adolf Hitler, is ready to unleash evil. But we need to know where it all comes from, because it doesn't just happen, okay? It happens for a reason. And if we don't understand the reason, then we can't understand how we're to move forward with that problem, okay? So, over on the left, I got to tell the William Jennings Bryan story. Great story. Another little piece of that narrative is back in World War I, William Jennings Bryan was the Secretary of State for Woodrow Wilson. And William Jennings Bryan was never sent to Europe to negotiate anything during World War I or before it even started. He was the Secretary of State, but never sent overseas to do his job. Instead, most of the banking institutions, representatives, and the business class really is more or less conducting U.S. foreign policy on behalf of the U.S. government and Woodrow Wilson. You should look up Edward Mandell House. He's a very interesting character in U.S. history. Another one of the effects of this committee report was a big push by men like Charles Lindbergh to lead an America First committee to not join World War II. Now, that was all going to change on Pearl Harbor, and the rest is history there. So, but this is a really interesting piece of history that needs to be understood, because policies that we still follow can be traced back to the time of the turn of the century. Another wonderful nugget, number 6, the Gold Act of 1934, truths that impact critical thinking. This is such a great one for you to understand. Private citizenship transferred to the government of gold coin in the United States was the law of the land after the Great Depression, during the Great Depression, when the government was learning how to respond to that. And they responded in the context of the Gold Act of 34, and since FDR and the Democrats had supermajorities essentially in the House, Senate, and the presidency, they were able to get the New Deal legislation, and much of that New Deal legislation helped the United States tremendously. I'm not here to pick winners and losers. What I'm here to say is the Gold Act of 1934 made it illegal for American citizens to ever use gold coin again, and it made it illegal for American citizens to trade that and use it as a system of money and currency. So, but the government gets it. So the government offered a 35 to 1 ratio, dollars per ounce, I think it was. I could be wrong, but something along those lines. Whatever it was. The government then built Fort Knox and put all the gold in there, so they're allowed to have it. Now, other nations in the Western world were doing the same thing to try to deal with the impact of the Great Depression. But that little tidbit of power, I mean, there's no question about it. Whoever has more gold will have more power. Done. Well, now the government has it all, okay? So think about it, right? This is another juicy nugget to come out of the progressive era. This is number 7, the eugenics movement. The progressives, as I mentioned before, included men like Theodore Roosevelt, but it also included women like Margaret Sanger. And just recently, actually, I believe she made the news just this week. I believe even Planned Parenthood had to admit that she was a racist, okay? But the challenge to understand this is anybody that believed in the eugenics movement at the turn of the century probably cultivated some pretty heavy bias, right? And yet they were exercising government power to determine essentially, right, and recommend, policies about who should procreate. We know, and there's no escaping this reality up in the upper right corner. This is global population growth after the Civil War era. Essentially, obviously everybody knows we have a population problem in the world, and it isn't going away. And there were people that were thinking about this when it was beginning, right? And those people got as I guess we could call it crazy, just for lack of a better term. These folks started to think about how they can better breed people, okay? Not by any sort of scientific thing, just by decisions and even laws at times. So that was the eugenics movement. And essentially this, and Margaret Sanger, this is the era that she promoted, and it became more acceptable in the United States, is the abortion, a very controversial issue today, right? And ultimately that push was going to be a federal change by a Supreme Court decision in 1973. So we're not going to get into all that, the abortion debate. But what we need to know is the eugenics movement encouraged abortion, and who did it encourage abortion amongst? People that were at that time considered undesirables. Well, undesirables at the turn of the century, going into 1900, was going to mean minority groups and third world countries. So the promotion of birth control and the promotion of abortion is really part of the eugenics movement. And the prisoners, nobody wanted prisoners that were going to procreate. And on this map here, oh no, don't go away. There you go. On this map here, you guys, these are states that had sterilization laws for inmates, okay? So this needs to be understood if you're going to understand the present, okay? Number 8, largely misunderstood, important, objective, true. So, but this is a really fun one as well to understand, okay? And when I say fun with these things, you guys, I'm not taking pleasure in the stories and the narratives. What we're talking about is really important, and it's fun to have new knowledge that you can then enter the discussion with. But this largely misunderstood or largely unknown event is a truth that should impact your critical thinking. After World War II, Operation Paperclip commences. An Operation Paperclip is an operation to bring former German scientists back into the West and into the United States and began a massive defense project and military prep buildup. I mean, that's what we use them for. The Nazis had the best military stuff in the world. They had the deepest, richest scientific knowledge in the world. There's just no question about it. And everybody was looking for their science. And the Soviet Union and the United States were in a race to pick up as many of them as they could, and yet the West just offered better living and standards of living to these guys, so anyone would be able to understand, as you would also be able to understand later, why people would want to get out of Eastern Germany come this era, so during the Cold War. So to get to the West, now we're going to gain all these benefits in this, okay, in this Operation Paperclip. And that man you see right there was a former Nazi. Now, whether he was forced to be one or whether he was one by choice, I don't really know. But at the end of the day, Wernher von Braun, who's going to be the first head of NASA, was a former Nazi, So I'm not saying he's as far as I know in the reading, a good man, right? Can a Nazi be a good man? I don't know. Can a slave owner be a good man? This is where we need to step back and have some real critical thinking, okay? We need to take it easy on the labels and stick to some of these objective understandings. Number 9, the National Security Act of 1947. This truth is huge. This is the defense apparatus infrastructure inside the United States that has created the Defense Department, the CIA, the NSA, the Joint Chiefs of Staff. The permanent military apparatus will all be put in place after the National Security Act of 1947. Remember, it's the United States' #1 job here after World War II to be responsible for international peace. We assumed that role, period. We tried to promote international cooperation, but at the end of the day, we assumed that role, and it led to the struggle, right, between the ideological war of communism and capitalism and democracy. So, and in that fight, I mean, I think a lot of people have heard this for sure, but I won't call it this as a little-known thing, as the military-industrial complex. Many people are aware of it. The neat part about it, when you get down into it, is really how that works and what our responsibility is with that. General Dwight Eisenhower and President Dwight Eisenhower uttered this phrase in his farewell address to the nation in 1961, where he said, "We have to be very careful, because the military-industrial complex has seized power essentially of everything, okay? Now, I'm being extreme there, but what he meant was it influences policy, okay? That we have all this infrastructure here now, the Cold War state. He said we do need it. We have a need for this buildup. It isn't make-believe, but thinking about in defense of the Soviet Union, which I would agree with. But the problem is its investments and its influence that it's going to take to fight it are going to impact legislation and impact policy, potentially in a very, very negative way. And it's going to tie the nation's perhaps political direction in the direction of major defense corporations, which it does. This takes up half, I'm exaggerating maybe a little, but close to half of the federal budget at the end of the day, okay, is national defense. And yet that's what the nation and national government's number one responsibility is. So neither is that a good nor evil. It just is, okay? I think some of the neat details when you get into is DARPA, the Defense Research Projects. These are now robot creatures that we are toying with, right? This is where a lot of our defense money goes. One of these B-2 stealth bombers is $2 billion. And if a sales contract is 10%, that's $200 million. There's happy people out there willing to go get that sales contract if you get the drift, right? And these think tanks are what we're seeing happen and emerge in Washington more and more. And these think tanks are influencing policy. And these are where individuals are influencing the narrative, right? These are the folks that we see on Fox and CNN giving their opinions and interpretations, right? And a lot of these folks are simply put called lobbyists. And they are going to be experts on particular fields. I'm not questioning their credibility. I'm not questioning their knowledge. But they will be able to influence much more closely the impact of government policy as it pertains to their knowledge area, which is going to be foreign affairs. Okay, and not just foreign affairs, but they'll also, obviously, you can impact domestic legislation too. So this is really a complex system, and what Eisenhower warned everybody is that only an alert and knowledgeable citizenry will be able to balance this out appropriately, okay? And I think the only thing that makes us, or not the only thing, but this is an important key concept. There's nuclear weapons in the world, there's weapons of mass destruction. So it's really important to know what's going on in the world. Really important. Now, to what extent do you influence based on that knowledge? That's the debate, okay? And good common ground starting points are great for debates, okay? And that should help. This, we're getting near the end here. Number 11, the welfare state. And I do not mean simply welfare, rich versus poor. It's not what we're talking about here. Because the welfare state, in quotes, whether it's corporate welfare that had been going on since the Gilded Age, or whether it was not corporate, but the welfare state that many describe it as now today, which is Social Security programs and dependency a little bit on government aid, unemployment compensation and the like, and food stamps. And the things most people gravitate toward when they think about the term the welfare state, but it's more complicated than that. We've had a welfare state as we understand it like that from 1945 to the present, and like I said, it even goes back many contexts to the Gilded Age. So I could even be persuaded to change my date start on that. Like I said, truths can be re-evaluated. And the military-industrial complex that had established itself in the post-World War II era was going to be added to by the ideas of Lyndon Johnson and the Great Society. Now, the military-industrial complex and the Great Society, government spending in defense and social programs, bam, that's where we are right now. That's why the United States government is in tremendous debt. And we need to understand and trace it back to its origins, okay, to understand it, if you want to understand that long-term issue. The last one here, this is a really fun one to end on, and fun and sad all at the same time. But basically, the Mujahedeen is the Taliban. Now, I just picked this one thing out of the current crises in the world because it shows the long understanding that's necessary. The Mujahedeen are Afghan freedom fighters during the Cold War that were fighting against the Soviet Union. So guess what? They were our allies then, okay? The Taliban, who is the same people, are our enemies after, obviously, 9/11 and beyond. So the same people that we were helping in 1979 and 80 and whenever we stopped, I can't remember the exact year off the top of my head, but we're now going to be the same people we were helping. And a lot of American soldiers were likely killed with weapons made in the USA. And this is a good one to end on today, thinking about the number one commodity in Afghanistan is opium. That's just another nugget for you, right? And if the number one infrastructure that brings resources into Afghanistan is opium, I think we understand why there's a lot of things we need to tie in and integrate our understanding in. I'll just leave it at that here with you guys today. So we'll do a summary here real quick, but the Civil War legislation was massive, right? The link between government and big business is done. The history of central banking is a must-comprehend skinny narrative if you're going to understand the modern idea of the Federal Reserve and its policies and the government connection with it. Theodore Roosevelt as the bull moose candidate and just really an American icon and leader of the progressive movement establishing the new precedent of government will intervene if there's a moral compass and a moral fiber that the government needs to symbolize. And Theodore Roosevelt really represented that quite well in the United States history. Anti-Semitism is a rich story. It isn't tolerated. It shouldn't be tolerated or sanctioned, but it has a historic origin that we all just need to understand, okay, and deal with. Number 5, the Nye Committee that we learned. We learned really how we got involved in World War I, and it left a bad taste in the majority of Americans' mouths. End of story. The Gold Act of 34, that consolidation of economic power in the hands of the federal government, a lot more. And the eugenics movement, number 7. It's something that needs to be part of everyone's common understanding before you can comment on the present. Operation Paperclip, 1945 and beyond, bringing bringing former Nazi scientists into the United States and Germans. Many of them were probably not Nazis, but they sure were forced to become them, right, during the war. So we wanted to bring them in, and we did. And has had a massive impact on even the National Security Act of 47 and the military-industrial complex. Those will just hit together. We understand the modern state of affairs and complexity. Now the government has to keep secrets from us. So to be a fully knowledgeable citizen, simply you need to realize and be humbled right away that you're not allowed to know certain things. And if you're not allowed to know certain things, that should frustrate you, right? As a citizen that wants to be informed to make wise political choices, right? The last thing, the Mujahedeen and the Taliban and the story in the Middle East is obviously not over, and our story's not over. But these nuggets should help at least cause more curiosity and hopefully get you guys to want to dig a little deeper. I'll talk to you guys next time. It's been a hoot. Adios.